James Carter's hands were calloused, rough from years of scrubbing floors, fixing broken pipes, and lifting heavy trash bags. The scent of bleach and old wood clung to his janitor's uniform as he stepped out of the office building he cleaned every night. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The city of New Orleans buzzed around him, cars honked, jazz music played faintly from a distant bar, and neon signs flickered, casting ghostly reflections on the wet pavement. He exhaled, watching his breath vanish into the cool night air. 10 years. 10 years since he had married Lisa, the woman who had been his anchor in a world that never seemed to give him a break. He had nothing extravagant to offer her, not back then, not now. But she had never cared about wealth. Still, James cared. He wanted to give her something real, to show that every moment with her had been worth more than gold. But all he had in his pocket was 5 crumpled dollar bills. His stomach twisted with frustration. A man should be able to buy his wife something beautiful, shouldn't he? He had spent the past week searching, his heart sinking every time he walked past jewelry stores with glass cases filled with rings that cost more than his monthly rent. But tonight, he refused to go home empty-handed. James turned down a narrow street, the kind most people avoided at night. The streetlights flickered uncertainly, and the sidewalk was cracked with time. Then, he saw it, a pawn shop, tucked between a liquor store and a laundromat, its sign faded but still readable, Henderson's Pawn and Jewelry, honest prices since 1965. A bell jingled as he pushed the door open. Inside, the shop smelled of aged wood and metal, like forgotten stories locked away in glass cases. Shelves lined with guitars, watches, old cameras, and dusty books surrounded him, but James walked straight to the counter. Behind it, an elderly man with silver hair and thick glasses peered at him, setting down a newspaper. He studied James with a knowing look, as if he had seen 1,000 men just like him, men with empty pockets but full hearts. "Help you with something, son?" the man asked, his voice rough like gravel. James hesitated, his fingers tightening around the money in his pocket. "I'm looking for a ring. For my wife." The old man nodded slowly, stepping out from behind the counter. "Anniversary?" James nodded. The jeweler studied him for a moment, then walked over to a small wooden box in the corner of the glass case. He flipped it open, revealing a collection of rings, simple, unpolished, second-hand. Some were slightly bent, others had faded engravings that time had worn down. James swallowed hard. These weren't the diamond-studded rings he had imagined. But maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it was the meaning behind it that counted. The old man picked up a small gold band and placed it on the counter. It wasn't flashy, but it had a quiet elegance to it. It looked well-worn, as if it had lived a life before this moment. "This one's $5, the jeweler said. James exhaled, relief flooding his chest. He reached into his pocket and placed the 5 bills on the counter. As the jeweler reached for the money, James spoke up. "Could you engrave something inside?" The jeweler raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Depends on what you want." James looked at the ring, picturing Lisa's smile. She always called him her king, even when he felt like nothing more than a struggling man in a uniform. And to him, she was everything. "Write this," James said softly. "To my queen, forever." The old man nodded, picking up the ring and turning toward his workbench in the back. James let out a breath, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and longing. He had done it. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was a promise, a reminder that even in the hardest times, love was something they would never lose. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the ring he had just bought carried a secret. A secret that would change everything. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The bell above the door jingled as James Carter stepped into Henderson's Pawn and Jewelry. The moment he crossed the threshold, a musty scent of aged wood and forgotten trinkets filled his lungs. The air inside was thick, carrying the weight of time, each object in the store holding a story, a past life. The dim glow of a flickering light bulb overhead cast long shadows across the glass cases, displaying items that once held value to someone but had been abandoned for cash. Old guitars with broken strings, watches with scratched faces, silverware that had lost its shine. James barely noticed any of it. His eyes darted straight to the section he had come for, the rings. Behind the counter, an elderly man sat hunched over a newspaper, his silver hair combed back neatly, thick glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked up at James with a slow, knowing gaze, as if he could already guess why he was here. "You looking to buy or sell?" the old man asked, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. James hesitated before speaking. "Looking to buy." The old man gave him another look, as if measuring the weight of his words. Then, without asking further, he rose from his stool and walked over to a small wooden box behind the counter. He unlocked it with a tiny key hanging from a chain around his neck and pulled out a handful of rings, simple, unpolished, second-hand. James shifted uncomfortably. These weren't the kind of rings people showed off in velvet boxes under bright showroom lights. These were the kind that had been pawned in moments of desperation, traded for rent money, groceries, or last-minute bus fare. Still, he had come here for a reason. The old man carefully placed a few rings on the glass countertop. "This is what I got in your price range," he said, glancing at James's worn-out shoes and the way his fingers fidgeted in his pockets. "No diamonds, no fancy stones. Just gold and silver bands." James nodded. "That's fine." He picked up one of the rings, rolling it between his fingers. It was a simple gold band, thin, slightly worn, but solid. The edges were smooth, as if it had been cherished by someone before him. Something about it felt right. "How much?" James asked. $5. James let out a slow breath of relief. He could afford this. It wasn't much, but it would mean everything to Lisa. He pulled out the 5 crumpled dollar bills from his pocket and placed them on the counter. As the old man reached for the money, James spoke again. "Can you engrave something inside?" The jeweler paused, studying James for a long moment before nodding. "What do you want it to say?" James hesitated, his mind filling with memories of Lisa's laughter, the way she called him her king even when they barely had enough to get by. She had always seen more in him than he saw in himself. "Write this," James said softly. "To my queen, forever." The jeweler's eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe, but it was gone before James could place it. The old man simply nodded and took the ring to the back. James leaned against the counter, exhaling. He had done it. Maybe it wasn't the most expensive ring, but it carried meaning. But as he waited, unaware of the storm brewing behind the curtain, the old man placed the ring under his magnifying glass to prepare for the engraving. And then, he froze. His hands, steady even after decades of work, trembled slightly. Beneath the dull scratches, beneath the years of wear, there was already an engraving. The words were faint, nearly erased by time, but still there. "To my queen, forever." J.C. The old man's breath caught in his throat. He wiped his glasses and looked again. The initials, J.C., matched. It couldn't be a coincidence. The jeweler's heart pounded in his chest as a chill ran through him. This ring had already belonged to a man with those same initials. A man who had once made the same promise of forever. And now, by some twist of fate, it had found its way back into the hands of another James Carter. The old man looked toward the front of the shop, where James stood patiently, completely unaware of the secret in his hands. The jeweler swallowed hard. This wasn't just a ring. It was a story waiting to be told. The old jeweler's hands trembled as he stared at the tiny engraving inside the ring. The words were faint, nearly worn away by time, but they were still there, etched into the delicate gold band, "To my queen, forever." J.C. He adjusted his glasses, blinking hard. His mind raced. He had owned this pawn shop for nearly 40 years, seen countless rings come and go, but this was impossible. He stole a glance at the man standing by the counter, James Carter. The young janitor, unaware of the history he was about to uncover, waited patiently, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, probably to hide the nervous way his fingers twitched. The jeweler took a deep breath, steadying himself. Maybe it was just a coincidence. JC wasn't exactly the rarest set of initials. But the engraving, the exact same words James had just requested, that was something else entirely. "Sir?" James's voice broke the silence. The jeweler flinched slightly before forcing a smile. "Just needed a closer look at the metal," he said, slipping the ring into his palm. His mind was still spinning, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to say something. Clearing his throat, he walked back to the counter, holding the ring carefully between his fingers. "This is a fine choice," he said slowly. "Are you sure you don't want to see anything else?" James shook his head. "This one feels right." The jeweler nodded, tapping his fingers against the glass. "Do you believe in fate, son?" James raised an eyebrow at the strange question. "Fate?" The old man turned the ring in his hand, watching how the dim light caught its edges. "Some things find their way back where they belong," he murmured. James frowned. "What do you mean?" The jeweler hesitated, then pushed the magnifying glass toward James. "Take a look inside the band." Curious, James picked it up, squinting as he turned it in the light. At first, he saw nothing but the smooth gold surface. But then, his breath caught. The engraving. His engraving. James's heart pounded as he traced the letters with his fingertip. "To my queen, forever." JC's exact words. His initials. His body stiffened. "What the hell?" His voice was barely a whisper. The jeweler watched him carefully. "That engraving was there long before you walked into my shop." James felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's not possible," he muttered. He had picked this ring at random. It had been just another cheap, forgotten band in a pawn shop. And yet, somehow, the exact words he had planned to engrave were already there, with his initials. "Where did this ring come from?" James asked, his voice tight. The jeweler rubbed his chin, thinking. "It's been in this shop for decades. I remember the woman who brought it in, years ago. An older lady. Said it belonged to her late husband." James's pulse roared in his ears. "His late husband? Do you remember his name?" James asked, his mouth suddenly dry. The old man frowned, searching his memory. "She called him Jonathan, I think. Jonathan Carter." James's breath hitched. Jonathan Carter. The name sent a cold chill racing down his spine. He swallowed hard, the room around him blurring as the realization crashed into him. Jonathan Carter was his grandfather's name. James had never met him. He had died long before James was born. But he had heard stories about how Jonathan had adored his wife, how he had worked tirelessly to provide for her, how he had given her a ring that, despite its simplicity, had meant the world to her. This ring. James's fingers clenched around the gold band as a strange feeling settled over him, something between awe and disbelief. Somehow, after all these years, after all the hands it had passed through, after being lost and forgotten in a pawn shop, his grandfather's ring had found its way back to him. "Son," the jeweler said gently, bringing James back to reality. "I don't think you chose this ring." He paused, his eyes full of quiet understanding. "I think it chose you." James looked down at the ring, his mind spinning. This was more than just a $5 purchase. This was a message. From the past. From fate. James Carter gripped the ring so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His grandfather's ring. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had come into this pawn shop with nothing but $5 crumpled in the hope of finding a simple wedding band for Lisa. Instead, he had stumbled upon something impossible, a piece of his family's history staring back at him. The old jeweler leaned on the counter, studying James carefully. "You all right, son?" James let out a shaky breath. I don't know. He turned the ring over in his palm, tracing the faded engraving. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. You said a woman pawned this years ago? The jeweler nodded. An older lady. I remember because she looked like she didn't really want to let it go. He sighed. Said it belonged to her husband. She needed money, but there was a sadness in her eyes when she left it here. James swallowed hard. Could it have been his grandmother? He barely remembered her, just a few distant memories from his childhood, when she would hum old gospel songs while rocking in her chair. She had passed away when he was young. But if she had pawned this ring, it meant she had held on to it for decades before finally parting with it. His stomach twisted. Why would she give up something so precious? The jeweler interrupted his thoughts. You said your name was James Carter? James nodded. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. That was her husband's name too, Jonathan Carter. James let out a breath. He was my grandfather. The jeweler's bushy eyebrows lifted slightly. Well, I'll be damned. James ran a hand over his face. This didn't feel real. He had never heard much about his grandfather, just bits and pieces from family members. He knew Jonathan Carter had worked hard his whole life, struggling to provide. He knew he had loved his wife fiercely. But no one had ever mentioned this ring. Do you remember when she pawned it? James asked, his voice uneven. The jeweler rubbed his chin, thinking. Had to be, maybe 20 years ago? Maybe more. James did the math. That would have been a few years before his grandmother passed away. But why had she given it up? Had she needed the money that badly? Or was there another reason? His fingers tightened around the band. Maybe this was why the ring had come back to him. Maybe he was supposed to find it, to learn the truth. I need to find out more, James muttered. He looked up at the jeweler. Do you remember anything else about her? The old man shook his head. Just that she was kind. And that she hesitated before letting it go. Like she was leaving behind a piece of herself. James exhaled, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had come in here looking for a ring to start his own love story with Lisa. Instead, he had uncovered a mystery about the love story that had come before him. The jeweler cleared his throat. Son, let me ask you something. James met his gaze. Do you believe in signs? James hesitated. He had never given much thought to fate or destiny. But now, staring at this ring, knowing its history, he couldn't ignore what was right in front of him. The jeweler nodded, as if reading his thoughts. This ring, this moment, wasn't an accident. Some things are meant to find their way home. James felt a lump form in his throat. Was that what this was? A piece of his grandfather's love story, finding its way back through time? The jeweler straightened. Tell you what. The engraving's already there, and I'd say it's perfect as is. He pushed the $5 back toward James. Take it. It's yours. James blinked. I can't take it for free. The old man chuckled. It was never mine to keep. He nodded toward the ring. That belongs to your family. James stared at him, overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you. The jeweler smiled. Go make your own love story, son. James slipped the ring into his pocket, his heart pounding. He had walked in here a man with almost nothing to his name. He was walking out with something priceless. He wasn't leaving the shop the same man who had walked in. James Carter stepped out of the pawn shop, his heart still hammering in his chest. The cool evening air brushed against his skin, but he barely noticed. His fingers curled around the gold ring in his pocket, its weight feeling heavier than before, not because of the metal, but because of the history it carried. He had come here with nothing but $5 and a dream of buying Lisa a wedding band. Instead, he had walked away with a piece of his past. A ring that once belonged to his grandfather, Jonathan Carter. A ring that had somehow found its way back to him. James exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. What did this mean? Was this just some wild coincidence, or was it something more? He pulled the ring out again, staring at the engraving, "To my queen, forever." J.C. His initials. His grandfather's words. A sign. James wasn't the kind of man who looked for signs in life. He had grown up believing in hard work, not fate. But right now, standing under the flickering streetlight, with the ring glinting in his palm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. He needed answers. He needed to talk to his mother. The bus ride home felt longer than usual. James sat by the window, his reflection staring back at him. He turned the ring between his fingers, lost in thought. His mother, Evelyn Carter, had always been the keeper of their family's stories. If anyone knew the truth about this ring, why his grandmother pawned it, why it had disappeared for so many years, it was her. As soon as he reached his stop, James bolted off the bus and hurried down the familiar cracked sidewalk. His childhood home wasn't far, just a few blocks away. He had moved into his own tiny apartment after getting engaged to Lisa, but his mother still lived in the same small house where he had grown up. James took the porch steps two at a time and knocked on the door. A few moments later, it creaked open, revealing Evelyn. She was in her mid-50s, her once black hair now streaked with gray, but her sharp eyes were just as he remembered. "James," she said, surprised. "What are you doing here this late?" "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice urgent. She frowned but stepped aside. "Come in." James sat across from his mother in the cozy living room, the familiar scent of vanilla candles filling the air. The walls were covered in old photographs, memories of birthdays, graduations, and faded black and white portraits of ancestors long gone. Without a word, James reached into his pocket and placed the gold ring on the table between them. Evelyn's eyes widened. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at it, as if seeing a ghost from the past. Finally, she whispered, "Where did you get this?" James leaned forward. "I bought it from a pawn shop. I was looking for a wedding ring for Lisa, and I don't know, something pulled me to this one." He swallowed. Then I saw the engraving. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she picked up the ring. She traced the words inside the band, her lips parting slightly. James watched her carefully. "Mom, this was Grandpa's, wasn't it?" She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. James exhaled. Even though he had suspected it, hearing her confirm it made his chest tighten. "Why did Grandma pawn it?" he asked softly. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. "It wasn't because of money," she murmured. She couldn't bear to keep it anymore." James frowned. "What do you mean?" His mother sighed, her fingers tightening around the ring. "Your grandfather loved your grandmother more than anything. They were inseparable. But when he passed away, she was never the same. She wore that ring every single day for years, refusing to take it off. Until one night, she woke up in tears and told me," Evelyn's voice broke. "She told me she had to let him go." James felt his throat tighten. "She said keeping the ring was keeping her in the past," Evelyn whispered. She wanted to move forward, but every time she looked at it, she was reminded of everything she had lost. A sad smile flickered across her lips. So, she walked into that pawn shop and left it behind. But she cried the whole way home. James swallowed hard. He couldn't imagine the pain his grandmother must have felt. His mother looked up at him, her eyes shining. "And now, after all these years, it's found its way back to you." James clenched his jaw. "I don't think it's just a coincidence." Evelyn shook her head. "Neither do I." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, softly, his mother reached out and covered his hand with hers. "Maybe this ring was never meant to stay lost," she said. "Maybe it was waiting for the right person to wear it again." James stared at the ring. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just his grandfather's story anymore. It was his. James Carter sat on the edge of his mother's couch, staring at the gold ring resting in his palm. The weight of it felt heavier now, not because of the metal, but because of the story it carried. His grandfather's ring. A symbol of love that had endured through decades, through loss, through time itself. Evelyn, his mother, sat across from him, her eyes still glistening with emotion. "You know," she said softly, "your grandfather never took that ring off. Not even once." James looked up. "Not even to sleep?" She shook her head. "Not even when his hands were calloused and cracked from working in the fields. Not even when he had nothing but a few dollars in his pocket. He always said," she paused, a bittersweet smile crossing her lips. James leaned in. "What did he say?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "A man isn't measured by what's in his pockets, but by what's in his heart." James exhaled. The words felt like they had been meant for him, like they had traveled through generations, waiting for the right moment to be heard. He looked down at the ring again. His grandfather had held on to this ring through poverty, through struggle, through everything life had thrown at him. And yet, his grandmother had given it up, not because she didn't love him, but because holding on to it had become too painful. James clenched his jaw. He had spent years feeling like he wasn't enough, like no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried, he was always one step behind. But now, this ring was in his hands. And maybe, just maybe, it was telling him something. He took a deep breath. "I'm going to give this to Lisa." His mother studied him for a long moment. "Are you sure?" James nodded. "I was looking for a wedding ring tonight. I thought I needed to find something new, something expensive to prove that I could take care of her. But now, I think," he swallowed. "I think this was always meant to be hers." Evelyn smiled, her eyes filled with something James couldn't quite place. "Your grandfather would have loved her, you know." James chuckled. "You think so?" "Oh, absolutely. She's got fire in her, just like your grandmother did." She reached over, squeezing his hand. "And she loves you. That's what matters." James nodded, his grip tightening around the ring. This was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a legacy. It was proof that love, real love, never fades. That night, James barely slept. He lay awake, the ring still in his hand, replaying everything in his mind. The next morning, he knew what he had to do. Lisa was in the tiny kitchen of their apartment, her back turned to him as she poured herself a cup of coffee. The morning light streamed through the window, making her dark curls glow like they had caught the sun. James took a deep breath. "Lisa," he said. She turned, smiling. "Hey, you're up early." She took a sip of coffee. "What's up?" James hesitated, suddenly feeling nervous. How do you tell someone that fate just handed you a love story bigger than yourself? Instead of trying to explain, he just reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. Lisa's eyes widened. "James, is that?" He nodded. "It's for you." Her breath hitched. "But, we don't have the money for, it's not new," he interrupted. "But it's ours." Lisa's gaze dropped to the ring, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. As soon as it touched her palm, she gasped. "There's something engraved inside." She turned it over and read the words aloud. "To my queen, forever. J.C." She looked up at him, confused. "James, this has your initials." He nodded. "It was my grandfather's." Lisa's lips parted in shock. "What? How did you?" James took her hand, his voice steady. "It found its way back to me. And now, I'm giving it to you." Tears filled her eyes. "James," he took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee. Lisa let out a small, breathless laugh. "Are you serious right now?" James smiled. "Lisa, I may not have much. I may not be able to give you a brand new ring, or a big fancy wedding, or a house on the hill. But what I can give you is this," he held up the ring. "A love that never fades. A promise that's stood the test of time." Lisa let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hand. James smiled softly. Marry me, Lisa. Be my queen. Forever. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him over. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. James laughed, holding her close as she cried into his shoulder. And when she finally pulled back, he slid the ring onto her finger. It wasn't new. It wasn't expensive. But it was perfect. And as Lisa looked at him, her eyes shining, James realized something. His grandfather had been right. A man isn't measured by what's in his pockets. He's measured by what's in his heart. James had never felt lighter in his life. Lisa's arms were still wrapped around him, her cheek pressed against his chest. The ring, his grandfather's ring, now rested on her finger, gleaming in the soft morning light. It's beautiful, she whispered, turning her hand to admire it. James kissed her forehead. It's more than just beautiful, Lisa. It's fate. She looked up at him, eyes filled with love, and something else. Curiosity. Where did you find this? She asked. James hesitated. He hadn't told her the whole story yet. It was in a pawn shop, he admitted. I was looking for a ring for you, and I don't know. Something about this one felt right. Then I saw the engraving. Lisa's lips parted in surprise. Wait, you didn't know it was your grandfather's ring when you bought it? James shook his head. Not until I turned it over and saw the initials. Lisa's breath hitched. That's unbelievable. I know. James ran a hand through his hair. That's why I think this was meant to happen. Lisa stared at the ring again, her brow furrowing. But how did it end up in a pawn shop? How long was it there? James exhaled. That's what I need to find out. Later that day, James found himself back at the small pawn shop, the bell jingling as he pushed open the glass door. The old jeweler, Mr. Whitman, looked up from behind the counter. His sharp blue eyes landed on James, recognition flickering in them. Back so soon? He asked. James nodded. I need to know more about the ring I bought last night. Whitman raised a bushy eyebrow. Something wrong with it? James shook his head. No, but it belonged to my grandfather. For the first time, the old man looked genuinely surprised. Your grandfather? James placed his palms on the glass counter. Please. I need to know how long you've had it. Who pawned it? Anything. Whitman studied him for a long moment, then sighed. He turned, rummaging through a drawer before pulling out a thick ledger. He flipped through the pages, fingers tracing faded ink. Finally, he stopped. This ring was pawned 12 years ago. James felt his stomach drop. 12 years ago? That was long after his grandfather had passed away. By who? He asked. Whitman tapped the page. It was an older woman. Evelyn Carter. James's breath caught in his throat. His mother. James stormed back to his childhood home, his mind racing. His mother had told him that his grandmother pawned the ring because it was too painful to keep. But if Whitman was right, then that meant she lied. He pounded on the front door. Within seconds, Evelyn answered, concern etched on her face. James? What's wrong? James held up the ring. Mom, you told me Grandma pawned this. Evelyn's eyes widened. James, Mr. Whitman said it was pawned 12 years ago. That means you were the one who gave it away. Why? His mother let out a shaky breath, looking away. I was trying to protect you. James frowned. Protect me? From what? Evelyn walked back inside, motioning for him to follow. James stepped in, shutting the door behind him. She sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. James, there's something I never told you about your grandfather's ring. James sat beside her, heart pounding. Tell me. She exhaled deeply. That ring, it was supposed to be cursed. James blinked. Cursed? Evelyn nodded. Your grandfather loved your grandmother with all his heart. But he believed that ring had power. He always said that whoever wore it would face hardship before finding true happiness. James scoffed. Mom, that's just a superstition. Maybe, she admitted. But after he passed, I saw what it did to your grandmother. She was never the same. She never moved on. And when you were growing up, I saw so much of him in you. The way you love Lisa, the way you hold on to things that matter. She swallowed hard. I was afraid you'd get trapped in the past, just like he did. James ran a hand over his face. So, you pawned it? Evelyn nodded. I thought if it was gone, you'd never have to carry its weight. James looked down at the ring on Lisa's finger, his chest tightening. Was his mother right? Had fate brought it back to him, or was it a warning? Evelyn took his hand. James, listen to me. No matter what that ring means, you make your own fate. Don't let an old story define your love. James met her eyes, swallowing hard. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But one thing was clear. This ring had found its way back for a reason. And he was going to find out why. James sat in his car outside his mother's house, gripping the steering wheel. The air inside felt suffocating. His mother's words still echoed in his head. That ring, it was supposed to be cursed. Cursed. James had never believed in superstition, but something about this didn't sit right. If his mother truly believed the ring brought misfortune, why had she never told him before? And if she was trying to protect him, why had it found its way back? His gaze dropped to his phone, his thumb hovering over Lisa's contact. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted her to take the ring off, just in case. But he hesitated. Taking a deep breath, James made a decision. He needed answers. The pawnshop bell jingled as James stepped inside, his jaw set. The old jeweler, Mr. Whitman, looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly. You again, he muttered. James walked up to the counter, placing both hands on the glass. I need to know everything about this ring. Whitman sighed, rubbing his temples. I told you, your mother pawned it 12 years ago. I'm not talking about that. James leaned forward. Before that. Where did my grandfather get it? Who made it? The old man's face darkened. He hesitated, then turned away and shuffled toward a dusty cabinet. James watched as he pulled out an old leather-bound book. Whitman flipped through its pages, stopping at an entry marked with a date nearly 50 years ago. His finger traced the words, and his expression hardened. This ring wasn't just bought, son, Whitman said slowly. It was custom-made. James frowned. Custom-made? Whitman nodded. Your grandfather had this ring designed. He came into my shop, back when I was a young man, and asked for something special, something unique. He looked up, eyes sharp. But here's the thing, James. When I asked him what engraving he wanted inside, he hesitated. James's breath caught. Why? Whitman exhaled. He said the words just came to him. Like they had always been meant for that ring. James's heart pounded. To my queen, forever. JC, it wasn't just a declaration of love. It was something more. Mr. Whitman, James asked, his voice low. Did my grandfather ever say where he got the idea for the engraving? The old jeweler hesitated, then gave a single nod. He told me he had seen it before. James stiffened. Where? Whitman closed the book and met James's gaze. On another ring. A ring that belonged to his father. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. This ring, it's a family heirloom, James whispered. Whitman nodded gravely. And if what I remember is correct, the ring before this one had the same engraving. The same message. The same initials. James felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't just a ring passed down. It was a cycle. A pattern. James didn't remember driving home. His thoughts were a storm, his hands shaking as he parked outside his apartment. Lisa was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he entered. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, setting her phone down. James walked straight to her, took her hand, and lifted it, staring at the ring. Lisa's eyes softened. "James, what's wrong?" He licked his lips, struggling for words. "This ring, it's been in my family for generations." "The engraving? It's not just from my grandfather. It's older than that." Lisa's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" James sat down beside her, exhaling. "It's like every man in my family has had this ring. And they all had the same words engraved in it. To my queen, forever. J.C." Lisa's lips parted in shock. "Wait. J.C.? That's your initials, too." James nodded, his chest tightening. "That's what's scaring me. My grandfather had it. His father had it. And somehow, it always found its way back, even when my mother tried to get rid of it." Lisa stared at the ring, then back at him. "James, what if this was always meant for you?" James swallowed hard. "What if it's not just a ring?" Lisa's fingers trembled as she traced the engraving. "What if it's a message?" James's heart pounded. A message. But from who? And why? The answers were out there. And James was going to find them. James didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring on Lisa's finger as moonlight streamed through the window. It should have just been a piece of metal, gold, valuable, sentimental at best. But now, it felt like something more. A thread tying generations together. A cycle that refused to be broken. His grandfather had worn it. His great-grandfather before him. And now, somehow, despite all odds, it had found its way back to him. Lisa stirred beside him, eyes fluttering open. "James?" Her voice was groggy, laced with concern. "You're still awake?" James swallowed hard. "I can't stop thinking about it." Lisa sat up, rubbing her eyes. "The ring?" He nodded. She studied him for a long moment, then reached for his hand. "Then let's find out the truth." James glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Lisa squeezed his fingers. "We start with your family." By morning, James had convinced his mother to dig through the old boxes in the attic. Dust filled the air as Evelyn pulled out worn photo albums, stacks of yellowed letters, and a small wooden chest with an ornate lock. James's stomach tightened at the sight of it. "What's inside?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated. "I don't know. It belonged to my father, and his father before him. No one's opened it in years." James ran a hand over the smooth wood, his heart pounding. He had a feeling the answers were inside. His mother handed him a small, rusted key. "If you're sure," James didn't hesitate. He slid the key into the lock and twisted. Click. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of old trinkets, folded notes, and a stack of photographs. James's hands trembled as he lifted the first picture. It was an old black and white photograph of his great-grandfather, standing beside a woman with piercing eyes. His fingers traced the edge of the photo, and that's when he saw it. The ring. On his great-grandfather's finger. James's breath caught. He picked up the next item, an aged letter folded neatly. He carefully opened it, his eyes scanning the faded ink. "To my queen, forever." J.C. James felt his heart stop. The exact same engraving. The same initials. Lisa leaned over his shoulder. "James, this is proof. This ring has been passed down for generations." But James barely heard her. His eyes drifted to the next letter beneath it. Unlike the first, this one looked like it had never been sent. His hands shook as he unfolded it. "My dearest Evelyn, I never wanted this burden to fall on you, but I know now that fate cannot be escaped. This ring, our family's ring, has always found its way back, no matter how far it's been cast away. My father before me carried it, as did his father before him. Each of us believed we were its final bearer, but we were wrong. If you are reading this, it means my time has passed, and James will soon find the ring. Do not stop him. Do not hide it from him. He must choose his own path. And when the time comes, he must uncover the truth of what this ring really means. With love, your father. James's hands clenched around the paper, his pulse pounding in his ears. His grandfather knew. He knew this wasn't just any family heirloom. He knew it had a purpose. Evelyn was pale, her lips parted in shock. I never read that letter. James met her eyes. Grandpa didn't want you to stop me from finding the truth. Lisa whispered, then what is the truth? James exhaled sharply, gripping the ring. He was going to find out. James stood in front of his grandfather's grave, the cold wind biting at his skin. The letter trembled in his hands. The ring felt heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of generations. For days, he had searched for answers. The old photographs, the letters, even the jeweler's story, they all led to this moment. The ring wasn't just a gift, wasn't just an heirloom. It was something more. Lisa stood beside him, silent, watching. His mother, Evelyn, kept her arms crossed, a shadow of unease on her face. James knelt, pressing his palm against the cool stone of the grave. J.C., his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and now, him. The initials weren't a coincidence. They were a pattern. A loop. A secret passed through bloodlines. Grandpa, James whispered, his voice raw. I know you wanted me to find the truth. I'm here. I'm listening. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery. Leaves rustled. A distant chime from a church bell echoed in the air. And then, James saw it. A small, barely visible inscription at the bottom of the gravestone. The same words. To my queen, forever. J.C.'s breath caught. Lisa noticed it too, her eyes widening. James, it's everywhere. James's fingers brushed over the carving, a chill running down his spine. His grandfather had known something. Had he left this as a final clue? Evelyn stepped forward, her voice trembling. I never understood why your grandfather was so obsessed with that phrase. He would say it under his breath sometimes, as if he was repeating something ancient. James clenched his jaw. Because it was. This ring isn't just a family heirloom. It's a message. A vow. A curse. Lisa whispered, or a promise. James looked down at the ring on her finger. She was right. This wasn't a curse meant to harm. It was a promise meant to protect. His great-grandfather had given it to his wife. His grandfather had done the same. And now, it had chosen Lisa. James took a shaky breath. This ring binds us. Every man in my family who's carried it has passed it on to the woman they loved most. His voice cracked. That's why it always comes back. It's not done until the promise is fulfilled. Evelyn's eyes glistened. And what is that promise? James met Lisa's gaze. His heart pounded, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from certainty. He knelt in front of her, took her hand, and held the ring between them. This isn't just a ring, he said softly. It's our family's way of saying forever, and meaning it. Lisa's breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. Then I guess I'm stuck with you, she whispered. James chuckled, slipping the ring fully onto her finger. Forever. The wind howled once more, almost as if the past had finally settled. The cycle wasn't broken. It was complete.